Hi, I'm Jeff Dixon. Welcome to Mosquito Bites and Mystery, Florida's Unknown History. That's the title of this series, or something like that. And what we're doing is we're looking at the history of the Sunshine State, the state of Florida, the great state of Florida, where we are broadcasting from, where I pastor a church in the Central Florida area, where this ministry calls home. And so the fact that you're connected with the church at 434 in Motion means that right now you are connected to a Florida ministry. And so what we're doing is we're taking a look at the Sunshine State because history is loaded with surprises and loaded with mystery. And if you're looking at history in Florida and you do a little exploration, you're bound to get mosquito bites because that's just what happens here. And so today I want to take you back to 1928. If history is any indicator of what was going on, in 1928, it is safe to say that things were heating up in Chicago for a gangster by the name of Al Capone. He was the undisputed king, by the way, of Chicago crime, and thanks to his political connections, he also ran the city. Chicago was Al Capone's town. His fame had spread across the world, but he decided he needed some time away from Chicago to get away from both the cold Chicago winter and the increasing interest in his business affairs by federal authorities. So Capone did what people still do to this day. Hey, let's go to Florida, because everybody comes to Florida because it's a great place to hide out, retire, and get away from the humdrum that happens in other places. Now, while Prohibition was taking place, it enabled Capone to make a fortune in illegal liquor. And it virtually shut down the beer business of Clarence Bush, the maker of Budweiser beer. So, about that time, Clarence Bush put his Miami mansion up for sale, and Al Capone needed a place to live in Florida. So he bought the mansion for $40,000. $40,000 was a hefty price for this mansion on Palm Island between Miami and Miami Beach. See, Miami at that time had undergone a huge land boom from 1920 to 1925. Land prices were escalating by the days. And as the boom was getting ready to turn to a bust, land prices were starting that front wave of beginning to collapse all around them. The arrival of Capone came at a time when things were starting to kind of crest and become a little bit rougher than it had been in the glory days of the buying boom. Because Capone had the gangster reputation, then Capone comes to town, and Capone further damages the property value of the people and the places and the homes around him, because everyone knows now there's a gangster that has moved to the island. Miami leaders were trying to sell the city as a vacation wonderland to get tourists to come, and they didn't want tourists to get the impression that because Capone was now associated with the South Florida area, that it was going to become another Chicago. And so the battle began. Capone was looking for a place to relax and get away from Chicago and the South Florida area. The leaders in South Florida wanted no part of Capone and his business and his reputation. And the battle began. See, despite the city's desire to be clean, it was just Chicago without the gunfire. By the time that Capone set up shop, gambling was everywhere. There was a saloon 1 block from police headquarters. And unlike Chicago, where most of the liquor was made in bathtubs and the aging process was counted in minutes, Miami could boast of the real stuff because they were bringing it in high-speed boats from Cuba or Bimini. Capone loved that. He claimed that he was simply a second-hand furniture dealer. That's what Al Capone said he did for a living. Everyone seemed to know different. The Miami News led a crusade to run him out of town. The city filed a suit saying his home was a menace to safety. The governor ordered all sheriffs to arrest him on site. And so a frequent visitor to the jails here in the state of Florida was none other than Al Capone. He was arrested several times. He was in Miami when the St. Valentine's Day Massacre took place in Chicago, a crime for which he was blamed, but he couldn't be arrested for it because, well, he was in Miami. In 1929, he went to jail in Philadelphia on a concealed weapons charge and then returned to Miami, where he really did take the time to try to improve his image. He hosted well-publicized dinners in Miami to convince the locals that, hey, I'm a good guy. You want me in your community. In early 1929, before he was sworn in as president, Herbert Hoover visited Miami and stayed near Capone at his friend's house. The friend's house, J.C. Penney. You've heard that name before. Owned a department store. Two different stories emerged from that era of history. The first one is that Herbert Hoover was in a hotel lobby in Miami, surrounded by reporters asking him a question about the plans for his new administration. The reporters began to become disinterested in the press conference that Hoover was having and began to drift away. Hoover asked an aide for what was happening, and the aide explained that Al Capone had walked into the lobby. And reporters considered Al Capone more newsworthy than the President of the United States. That's story one. The second story is that Herbert Hoover was awakened one night by gunfire. When he asked what was happening, he was told it was coming from Al Capone's home. It was this moment in Florida history where something happened because Herbert Hoover made a decision. He ordered his Treasury Department and his new administration a two-word memorandum, a two-word command, a two-word mantra that would be repeated and repeated and repeated. Herbert Hoover was the one who uttered the phrase, "Get Capone." And in that moment, the government launched a massive effort to jail Capone. And eventually they got Capone, not for the murders, not for all of the illegal liquor, not for all of the other organized crime, gambling, and things like that. Eventually Capone goes to jail for tax evasion charges. But they got him, and he ends up in prison. He was convicted, sentenced. For years, he had suffered from syphilis, and his condition became worse during the 6 years he was in prison. By the time he was released, he was suffering from dementia, and he returned to his Miami home. If you were to see Capone in those days, aides would push him out to the dock, put him in a chair, put a fishing pole in his hand. And when reporters began to get too close to where the gangster was out on the dock fishing, he would be hustled back into the home. In 1947, Al Capone died. He was 47 years old, and he was gone. Miami was the last place he called home. See, when you read the postcards or you read the publicity for the South Florida, Miami area, the stories and the legends of their infamous resident, Al Capone, aren't usually included as part of the highlights of his life or their history. History has a funny way of catching up with you and eventually revealing what's really happening. And so the spiritual moment that I want you to take away from this is recognize that each day of your life, you are living out and you are creating and writing a history that one day, someday, people will look at. And they'll look back at your life and the places that you went and the places that you touched and the people that you impacted. And they will make some type of judgment on the type of life that you led. For Miami, Al Capone is a blemish in their culture. He is a resident that they never wanted as a resident. He's a part of their history that if they could bury it and get it off site and out of the pages, they would. But history doesn't work that way because we're constantly writing history. And so the challenge is to make sure that the history that you're creating is history that's worth something, that is inspiring, and is something that in generations to come, when people think about it or hear about you, they're not embarrassed by it, and they see your life as inspirational, and they see your life as leaving a legacy for others to live up to. That's the lesson this week from the state of Florida. All about a gangster, a new president, and a Miami mansion that was built when the liquor business went bust. It's the stuff of a great story, right? Welcome to Florida. I look forward to joining you next time for our next edition.